Well, hello there, Facebook. Taylor Himness here from 41 Action News, bringing you another episode of Faith in KC. Excited to bring you this episode today. Thanks again for watching the past episodes. If this is your first, welcome. I've talked about in previous episodes that I am a Christian. I was raised in the Church of Christ. I still attend a Church of Christ. I went to a Church of Christ university. I'm very proud of my faith, if that's the right way to put it. And open with my faith. I stumble, I fall on a regular basis. My faith is nowhere near as strong as I would like it to be, but it's a massive part of my life. Always has been, always will be. I tell you that because today's episode is the first that I am talking to a Christian pastor. I've talked to people from the academic community, obviously, a rabbi, the first episode, but this is my first Christian pastor to speak to, and I'm very excited to speak to him. I've been excited to pick this man's brain for months now. His name is Pastor Phil Hopper. He's from Abundant Life Church in Lee Summit. This is the church you may have heard about back in May that sued Jackson County to be able to have people come back in during that 10-10-10 span. They sued for the right to bring people in. Got a lot of news coverage, and I really wanted to ask him about it. I've never met the man, but I knew I wanted to ask him about it. This is a little bit different because we concluded our interview earlier today, and when we got through, I was on the phone with my wife telling her about it because she knew I was going to interview him today, and she asked a question that I did not ask him during our full interview. And I thought I absolutely should have asked him that. So he was kind enough to do another Zoom interview with me, a follow-up, in which I asked him the question my wife asked, and I thought it was really worth putting in. So first I'm going to play that for you here and let you hear that response, and then I'll introduce the rest of it. Pastor, one question that I should have asked you during our original interview and I didn't, is about the relationship between faith and science. Fair or unfair, I think that people of faith have come to have a reputation for not following scientific recommendations, and not just in the pandemic. I've talked about with a previous guest that whole God sent a canoe and then a helicopter and all that kind of thing for the person that's saying only God, God's going to save me. I'm not paying attention to, I'm not worried about anything else. God's going to save me. How much consideration was given to the health aspect of bringing back people whenever the lawsuit was filed and you first started to bring people back? How much consideration was, hey, is this health-wise? Are we not paying attention to the things we're paying attention to? One, and two, do you feel like the actions of Abundant Life contributed to a thought process? Well, Christian people don't really pay attention to science. They're just worried about if it's in the Bible or not. Because I know it's difficult to explain something you believe to a non-believer that's not, empirical. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say there should never be any conflict between faith and reason, or faith in the intellect, or faith in science. God is the author of the sciences. God is the author of all the scientific laws that govern our universe. So unfortunately, I think there's been a false dichotomy between I have to be a person of faith or a person of reason. Isaiah 1:18 says, "Come now, let us reason together." So God gave us an intellect for a reason. One of the reasons I'm a Christian is because it's not a blind faith. It's a faith that is based on rational, plausible evidences, historical, archaeological. And that's one of the reasons I'm sold out to Jesus, because there's a aspect of our faith that is very much a plausible, rational, provable foundation, which is the resurrection. Historically, for example, I can show you the reasons for the resurrection of Jesus Christ using fallible evidences, or I should say infallible evidences, for the same reasons you believe anything in history that you weren't there to see it personally. So I don't believe there's a dichotomy where you have to choose. I don't believe we should choose. I think modern science and medical advances are things that we should be thankful for. And so, as we decided to regather and be very proactive about regathering as a church family, even to the point of suing for the right to do so, there was very much a thought about, can we do this in a way that is safe? And again, just common sense says if it's safe enough for people to gather in a bar, to go drinking together, if it's safe enough for people to gather in a restaurant, to go to dinner together, it should be safe enough for people to gather in a church to go worshiping together. If they can do it safely there, we think we can do it safely here using the same guidelines that everybody else is using. And so it was very much important to us that we would do it in a way that was safely. We're not just going to throw the doors open as if everything is the same and say, y'all come back and not use any caution. Faith has to be fearless, but faith is not reckless. And there's a difference between being fearless and being reckless. So we weren't being reckless at all by regathering our church. And we told people that you should use your own judgment. If you're high risk, if you're immune deficient, if you're in that category, then you should probably consider staying home, continue to worship online. Take some extra precautions. If you're ready to come back on site, we believe you should have the freedom to do that too. And that's why we fought to have the freedom to regather. People should be free to make their own choice if we can do it safely. And I think we have done it safely. We have, we're at 50% occupancy by Jackson County mandate. We've chosen to actually do below 50% in our auditorium. And that was self-selected because we felt like to really social distance, we really can't do it with 50%. So we're actually about 30% is what we're allowing in an auditorium. And when we hit that number, we have an overflow building where members are going to a different building altogether and gathering. So I don't think there's ever a time as Christians that we should choose either to live by faith or live by our rational ability to reason. God gave us the ability to do both, and we shouldn't really have to choose between one or the other. We know as Christians, God is sovereign over our lives. He holds our next breath in his hands. Our next heartbeat belongs to him. But he still gave us the rational powers of reason to put on a seatbelt before I drive down the interstate. And I'm not lacking any faith whatsoever when I put my seatbelt on every time I get behind the wheel of a car. It's just using common sense God gave us.
And you don't feel like, even not necessarily the lawsuit, but the actions of a church coming back and being back in person. I told you that my church is coming back in person, I think, this week. Taking actions like that serves to tell non-believers, see, they don't follow the science. They're a faith people. They're a heart people, not a brain people.
Well, again, if restaurants are following the science and social distancing, masking up, if bars are following the science, social distancing, telling people to mask up, if grocery stores and hardware stores and various other organizations, and look, if the science works in those buildings, then the science ought to work in a church building. Again, the activity inside a building doesn't make it any more or less dangerous, even during a time of a pandemic. And so, if we were just throwing caution to the wind and basically telling the healthcare medical community, no, we're not going to mask up, we're not going to social distance, we're going to see how many people we can put in our auditorium, then anybody would have a right to question whether or not we're even in our right mind.
Sure.
But in this case, we're following the same rules everybody else is, because we do believe in science, and we do believe that the healthcare industry knows things that the rest of us might not. And even if they don't, they're doing the best they can right now to curb a pandemic of which none of us have ever lived through. So let's do the best we can to cooperate with them while we exercise not just our biblical mandate, but our constitutional right to worship.
So again, my thanks to Pastor Phil for doing 2 interviews with me today so I could ask that follow-up question that I thought was very worthy, and I hope you'll remember his answer as you're listening to the rest of this episode. As always, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, you can reach out to me. You can find me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or you can email me at taylor.himness@kshb.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your suggestions for people we should have on in our next episode. Please share this if you'd like. Leave your comments. Please be civil, but tell us what you think, and hope you enjoyed this episode of Faith in KC.
I'm excited for my guest today. My guest today is Pastor Phil Hopper from Abundant Life Baptist Church in Lee Summit. And Pastor, I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for obviously a very busy schedule. I can watch the Abundant Life Facebook page and know that you're busy just from a Facebook video recording aspect. You've got a lot that you do. So I appreciate you taking some time out.
Taylor, I'm honored to get to spend some time with you, have a conversation. I love talking about faith with anybody, anywhere, anytime. So thank you for the invitation.
I told Pastor Phil, and if you haven't been watching all the episodes, I let Pastor Phil know that he is the first Christian pastor to be featured on this series. We've spoken to a rabbi. We've spoken to people from the academic community. He will by no means be the last, at least I hope, if we're able to continue doing this series for a while. But I'm glad to have him on. If you're not familiar with Pastor Phil or with Abundant Life, Phil, I want to give you a chance just to talk a little bit about yourself and your faith background, because I know you came from law enforcement as well, and then tell people about what you'd like them to know about Abundant Life as we get started.
Sure. So I graduated from the University of Kansas the December of 1991. So Rock Chalk, Taylor, I don't know if you're in Johnson County, Kansas, so I hope maybe I'm building a bridge here. I don't know for sure if I am. You take a chance to say you're from KU in this part of the world, especially living in Missouri.
Sure.
I had no idea I'd be in ministry, had no idea I'd be a pastor. By the time I had graduated from University of Kansas, I was a committed Christian by that time, but still didn't know I'd be in vocational ministry. Went into a career in law enforcement, spent 8 years on the KCPD as a supervisor, as part of Kansas City TAC unit, SWAT team. It's all I thought I would do for 25, 30 years. But I tell people, you choose your career, you don't choose your calling chooses you. And so I'd chosen a career, but what I didn't anticipate was that a calling would choose me, and that was a calling to the ministry. People ask sometimes, well, how do you know when you're called? And for me, Taylor, it's when I couldn't say no. So it was the late 90s. I'm a young father with a young family, and we are just looking for a church to go to. And there's this little bitty church in Lee Summit at the time that had just started going, and we walked through the doors that day in August of 1997. Never dreamed I'd be a pastor, much less that one day I would pastor that church that would eventually become Abundant Life. And so shortly after coming to this little church in Lee Summit, I did surrender then at some point to pastor or preach or go overseas and be a missionary. I had that sense of calling upon my life that really I don't have an option. If I want to be in the will of God, this is something I have to do. But even then, I didn't dream it would be when it was or where it was or how quickly that door would come. I thought it may even be like, post law enforcement, something like that, years away. So it's a Tuesday night in September of 99. What I didn't know is our pastor that had started the church would resign fairly suddenly. Tuesday night, member of our board called me out of the blue and said, our pastor has resigned. We need somebody to preach Sunday. Would you mind filling in? And so with much fear and trepidation, I said yes. And at that time, I had preached exactly twice in my life, once on a Sunday night to about 12 people, 2 of which was my mom and dad, because if you can't get your mom to come here, you know you're in trouble.
Right.
4 of which were cops I'd brought along with me just to make sure I had an audience. So that was my big debut as a preacher.
Is the only reason they ask you because of how tall you are? Was that the big reason they asked you to do it? Because you're what, 6'4"?
I'm 6'6".
6'6". Is that the reason? Why did they ask you to preach if you had no experience?
Yeah, it goes to show the desperate situation. All right, it's weird. You're calling up a cop to come preach on Sunday. We were a small church, Taylor. There really wasn't a lot of options. There wasn't a lot of places to go.
Right.
So they'd heard I was studying to go into ministry and preparing for ministry. So they thought, let's have Phil come speak. I actually that Sunday night to literally 12 people One of the people in the audience that night, besides my mom and dad and the police I brought along with me, just to make sure I had an audience, was a member of our board. So I think he'd heard me, a few months earlier and thought, well, Phil won't, he won't mess this up too bad. Well, I thought it'd be one and done. And then they asked me to do it again. I thought it'd be two and done. Then they asked me to do it again. And I thought it'd be three and done. 4 months later, they were calling me to be their full-time pastor. And so in March of 2000, I went to Bidacop. I woke up a pastor. That was 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how many, for people that aren't familiar with Abundant Life, obviously it's grown quite a bit in your time there. On pre-COVID, on a normal Sunday, how many people are attending Abundant Life Church?
It was probably about 6,000 pre-COVID between our Lee Summit location, Blue Springs location, and we're launching a third location in Independence that's already started gathering. The official launch won't be until early in 2021.
That main campus, though, there in Lee Summit ballpark, how many people are in the building on Sunday morning?
There'd be 4,500 just in the Lee Summit campus by itself.
Wow. So COVID hits, and the world, everyone has to start making some changes to the way they do business. Churches at the top of that list, because all of a sudden we can't gather in large quantities. I remember kind of being told by my church, listen, we don't know how long this is going to last, but we can't have people in the building for a while. When you have a large congregation like that, I don't want to use the term mega church by any means or anything like that, because I know you've referenced even on Facebook that is often used as an attack type of terminology. A large congregation like that, and all of a sudden you've got to make a decision about what to do and how to do it. What's that process like?
Yeah, so back in March when the stay-at-home orders began, obviously this is a world any of us have ever been in. So what do we do? I'm the guy that for 20 years told our church, we will never cancel Sunday morning. Like, even in a blizzard, we're going to have church. If you can make it, come. If you can't, that's okay. And so, I'm the guy that said we will never not have church Sunday morning on site. But that was, when we're talking about blizzards in the Midwest, winters, nobody ever anticipated a pandemic. And so, what we say at our church, the mission of our church is to be living proof of a loving God to a watching world. And so that has been kind of how we tried to make every decision. Listen, this is an unknown back in March. COVID is in Kansas City. We can't really be living proof to our city if we decide to have church just like normal and everybody else is staying at home and businesses are closing and livelihoods are at stake. So that was a hard decision to make, because we really believe gathering the body together is an essential part of Christian living for a number of reasons. But we do have the ability in modern technology to gather remotely now as well. And so, had this been 20 years ago, it would have been a much harder thing to navigate for churches. But in our case, with modern technology, it doesn't have the impact it might have at one time. So like every other church in town and business in town, we closed our doors from gathering, and obviously don't regret doing that at all, to try to do our part in curbing the spread of COVID.
I want to ask you about the caring for people part of ministry and of church life. I know that we're going to have people that listen to this that are not members of a faith community, are not necessarily churchgoers, so to speak. But I think it's fair to say that most churches, at least most churches I've ever been in and most churches I've ever spoken to, have some form of outreach. This is who we care for. We do this with the local school. We work with the local soup kitchen, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
How that took on a whole new role for Abundant Life and what it looked like in the middle of a pandemic. What did caring for people look like whenever COVID hit?
Well, the good news is, Taylor, we didn't have to figure out what we were going to do to care for our city. A lot of the ministries we already had in place, we'd been doing for a long, long time. We have a food pantry that gave away 1 million pounds of groceries a year ago. I don't say that braggadociously at all. I'm just saying one of our core values is serving and serving our community, serving our city. So a year ago, our food pantry gave away 1 million pounds of groceries. But in the first 8 weeks of COVID, we almost surpassed in those 2 months what we had already done in the previous 6 months in terms of serving our community and just the under-resourced. In addition to that, we have a relationship with the public school systems where, of course, they identify kids that won't have healthy meals on the weekend. And so it's called the backpack program, and they'll send backpacks down to our church on a Friday, and we'll send them back full of food for those kids to have food on the weekends. And so those types of ministries we've had in place for years and years. We did a back-to-school supply outreach at both our Blue Springs location and Lee Summit location, where we served, I think, about 800 families, where as a drive-through this year because of COVID, and families would drive through and we would hand them a bag full of not just back-to-school supplies, but, essentials, new underwear, toothpaste, toothbrushes, those kinds of things. And so this is very much in our DNA of who we are. And so when COVID hit, I told our church 2 things. We're going to be fearless and we're going to be selfless. And you look back historically in times of pandemics. Listen, pandemics are new to us in the 21st century, but they're not true at all in the scope of history and humanity. You see how the early church ministered in times of pandemics, and the records are very clear. If you look back through church history at the eyewitness accounts, where many of the Romans and the pagans of that era were literally throwing their own family members out on the street to die alone, to get them out of the house, so scared of spreading this disease. And Christians were literally going out in the streets, picking up people that weren't even in their own families, bringing them into their own homes and nursing them back to health.
Yeah.
And so this is the precedence that we have to go on as Christians. And so when I say fearless, there's times to be fearless, and we had to make some fearless decisions along the way. And there's times to be selfless and lay down our rights and even be willing to lay down our life for others. And that's what Christians have done historically.
Pastor, I want to ask you about that idea of caring for other people when it comes to people outside the church. What do you think is the awareness level, the understanding, however you want to describe it, of people who are not parts of a faith community when it comes to the importance of that to a given church, whether it be Abundant Life or another congregation? Do you think that non-churchgoers have an understanding of the role that care plays? I mean, because I think, again, I've been a churchgoer all my life, so it's difficult for me to speak as a non-churchgoer, but I think most non-churchgoers understand, okay, you go to church on whatever day that you go and worship, most people Sunday morning, you believe X, Y, Z, you agree with this, you don't agree with this. Do you think that most people who are not part of a faith community or don't have a faith background understand the importance of the caring for people aspect of a church's life?
Well, unfortunately, I think most non-church going people don't know, because the church has not always done a great job of caring for people outside the walls of their church. Even though I think clearly one of the core values of Christianity, Jesus said these words, "The Son of Man, speaking of himself, did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many." These are the words of the one we follow. And too much of the time, the church has said it, but we haven't showed it. And that's why the mission statement of our church is be living proof of a loving God to a watching world. The world can't see God, but they can see us. So it has to be Colossians 1:27, Christ in us, the hope of glory. That's why we're called his body. We're literally, in some way, his ambassadors on the earth. He dwells within us. And so if we don't do it, who's going to? But unfortunately, I think many times through the years, the church has been a members-only club, and it's been that inwardly focused mentality. So the non-church people don't really understand what the church is. They see the church often as parasitic. Okay, what do we do to contribute anything to society? Sometimes they see us as just taking from society. Everybody knows churches don't pay taxes. Years ago, the IRS declared churches as a charitable organization. So it's a not-for-profit status. So if they're not paying taxes, what are they doing? And
Right.
just truthfully, sometimes the church hasn't been doing anything but meeting when Jesus has called us to be doing and moving. And so sometimes I think the church has not done a great job of serving those outside the walls of our church. And so if, a lot of people outside of church has a negative impression of church, that could have more to do with us than it does them.
Is it at all because Christians, and I say this as a Christian, I know I've been guilty of it, are better at projecting who we are as, well, we're on the straight and narrow, versus who we are as a pastoral group? Is it better? Is it because we're more of a I'm better than you mentality sometimes the outside world?
I think at times that's very much what it comes off as. It can come off as a holier than thou, we're better than everyone else. And it's easy to sit behind the safe walls of your church, the Christian compound, and kind of lob verbal hand grenades over the top of the wall and talk about how bad the world is. But of course, that's not at all what Jesus did. And so we've worked hard in 20 years to change that. We've done a carnival until this year. COVID shut it down. We've done a carnival for our city every September for almost 20 years. I'm talking a real carnival. I'm talking rides, games, food, the whole thing. And it's completely free to anybody, many of which will never darken the doors of our church.
Yeah.
And people try to pay us. Well, can I donate? We don't take anything from them, because the average person that doesn't go to church, they think church is just another place that wants my money. And we're trying to prove to them that, we're not trying to get something from them. We're trying to give something to them. God is for you. He's not trying to get something from you. He's the one that gave his life, the eternal sinless Son of God, died for our sin and rose again. And so we're trying to embody that, because I think, Taylor, too many times the church hasn't done a great job through the years of doing that at all.
So Pastor Phil knows that I'm going to ask him this question. If you're watching this and going, I can't believe he invited this man on and then asks him about a tough topic like this, I want to ask Pastor Phil about the lawsuit that Abundant Life filed earlier this year, back in May, in the middle of the pandemic. If you're not familiar, we've got stories about it on kshb.com. I think a lot of people are familiar with it. Pastor Phil, your church was intending to follow Kansas City, Missouri's that 10-10-10 rule. I think most of us remember that 10%, that 10-10-10 rule.
Right.
But Jackson County had a different set of regulations, and Jackson County was not going to allow churches to meet in person when other businesses, we'll say the word businesses there, restaurants, even bars, that kind of thing, weren't going to be allowed to reopen. Abundant Life sued Jackson County back in May for the right to have people in their building, in your building. Walk me through that process of why that decision was made, why you felt like it was necessary to take that, because I think a lot of the criticism, I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard, a lot of the criticism was, well, why do they have to be in a building to be able to worship? They're already they've been doing in-person or the online worshiping for 2 months, and it's working fine. A lot of people said it was about money. Well, they just need money back in their sue for the right to meet in person.
Yeah. So that's a fair question, Taylor. And let me just say, that was by far and away the hardest decision in 20 years that we've had to make, because for 20 years, all we've honestly tried to do is serve our city and love and bless our city. We never wanted to be the church that's known for the church that sued Jackson County. We want to be the church that is known to be living proof of a loving God to a watching world. And so, very, very difficult decision. When I say there's a time to be fearless and a time to be selfless, it was one of those times that, this is a time to be fearless, because we know what's going to happen when we do. And I understand, look, especially people that maybe don't have a faith, don't go to church, why would they understand? It's hard enough for those sometimes in the church to understand at a time like this. But are prepared, and I told our church from the very beginning, biblically as Christians, we have a biblical mandate to obey the ordinance of government. Okay, Romans chapter 13, 1 through 5 tells us that human government, civil authority comes from God. In other words, government is one of the institutions, in addition to family, in addition to the church, human government is one of the institutions ordained of God for the good order of society, for the protection and prosperity of its citizenry. And Romans 13, 1 through 5 tells us that. Then the Apostle Peter said in 1 Peter 2:13, obey every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. In other words, for the sake of the Lord's reputation, be a good citizen. Obey the laws of the land, right? And so the clear teaching of Scripture is that when we can and where we can, we should obey the ordinance of man, which is why, we shut down with everything else. And we were going to and have since tried to follow all the health mandates as it relates to occupancy and the masking up and all of that to try to do this well in a way that hopefully is living proof of a loving God. Like we're really trying to gather as a body like we've been commanded by Scripture and still think about serving our city. And so what a lot of people can't understand, especially if they don't have a faith, is what makes American society unique in really all of human history is the Bill of Rights, beginning with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that the government shall not infringe on the freedom of religion or the exercise of religion. And so what grabbed our attention was when the new order was, in our minds, clearly discriminatory, where if it's safe enough for friends to go to a bar together and go drinking together, or it's safe enough for a family to go to a restaurant together and go to dinner together, it's got to be safe enough for friends to gather at a church and go worshiping together. It's just common sense. So I'm not suggesting there was anything malicious in that mandate. I don't necessarily have any reason to think our county officials have it in for churches or have it in for religion. They've got an incredibly difficult job to do right now. They're leading through a pandemic, which none of them have ever done either. We are for our governing officials. We're really not against them. But we felt like after having tried to work with the county, and we'd made several calls over there, and nobody really would talk to us. Nobody would really give us any information. Like, we wanted to partner with them and come to a workable solution. And in the end, we didn't really get a lot of cooperation or get really even a conversation. So we felt like, not just for our church, because here's the deal, Taylor, 95% of our giving is already done online.
Yeah.
We stand to gain nothing financially from regathering on site, nothing. Not only that, we need to be clear, we didn't sue for money. We got no money. We weren't suing for money. We were suing for the right to regather. And so, a lot of people think, oh, big church, they need the money. Actually, our giving has grown by 3% over last year during a COVID economy. So what motivated us was never for the money, but it was for the right to regather. And we felt like that it was there's kingdom issues at stake, there's constitutional issues at stake. And even for those that don't have a personal faith, that are not religious, we as Americans ought to want to guard the rights of all Americans that have made American society so unique in all of human history. And the first and foremost begins with freedom of religion. And so it's not that we thought anybody was being malicious toward the church, but simply that this is clearly a breach of the First Amendment, and it's discriminating against houses of worship, not just churches, but synagogues and mosques. And a lot of people forget that while Abundant Life and churches like ours have the resources to have a very vibrant online presence, there are dozens, if not hundreds of churches throughout Jackson County that are very small churches, storefront churches. They don't have an online presence.
Right.
these churches are suffering bad. And so we felt like it was the right thing, not simply for our church, but for the church and for every house of worship to challenge this ruling. Because the thing is, even during a pandemic, the Constitution is in place still for a reason and can't just be disregarded on a whim based on, the crisis that we're in.
So I want to make sure that I'm reporting correctly here. So because that was early May is when that lawsuit was filed. The results of that were, because I know that Jackson County came back and amended. Did you eventually just drop the lawsuit because they made some changes? What was the end result of the filing of your actual lawsuit?
So they did amend it, and we were thankful, obviously. And a lot of other churches were too, Taylor. We heard, I don't know, it felt like from 100 churches that honestly we'd never even heard of. We didn't even know were there. Smaller churches, smaller congregations. Thank you for taking the bullet for all of us, because it was ugly, it was brutal, it was bloody. I mean, I hadn't been called some of those names since I was a cop. Which, hey, you know what? I can take it. Look, those of us in public leadership, you're going to have to make unpopular decisions, and not everyone is going to understand. And if you can't take the heat, don't get in the arena. That's just the nature of leadership. And I don't regret the decision, but it was hard because we do love our city. And I think that decision was misunderstood by a lot of people. But technically, the lawsuit is still ongoing.
Okay.
And their attorney, our attorney is still, I think, working on language. Our attorney has told us, because here's the deal. We don't want to have to redo this another time with another pandemic down the road somewhere.
I mean, even this one could come back and they absolutely could come back and say, we're shutting down again.
Yeah. So we don't want to have to do that. We want there to be kind of a precedence moving forward that churches, houses of worship will be treated the same way as other organizations and institutions and not different than. We're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking to be treated constitutionally and then just fairly as it relates to other organizations in our area.
You're not the only church to have filed lawsuits either locally or nationally during this time, so I don't want to make it sound like Abundant Life was the only church that did anything like this, because you're not. You mentioned some of the other churches that have supported you and reached out. I'm curious what you think. Is this how much was the size of Abundant Life and a 4,500 plus person congregation? How big a role do you think personally it played in the efficacy of getting? I mean, say a 200 person church files the same lawsuit, or a 4,500 person mosque, a different situation. Do you think the fact that you are a big Christian church played a role in the efficacy of ringing those alarms?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it did necessarily. A church of 200 could have filed the same lawsuit and probably, hopefully, gotten the same result, because the law is the law. The Constitution is the law of the land, and our governing officials have to be held accountable for governing lawfully. That's what we're asking them to do. And so I would hope that a church of 200 that filed a suit with an attorney would have the same results we would. But we do have a sense, because of the size of our church, that God has given us a mantle of leadership in our city to do things that other churches can't do. And that's what we heard a lot from smaller churches. Thank you for doing what we could not have done, that we don't have the resources to do. And so, Jesus said, to whom much is given, much more is required. And because God has given us much at Abundant Life, he's given us a large sphere of influence. We feel like that this was a time we needed to lead the way and not duck for cover and hope somebody else does.
Did you get any of those messages of thanks from houses of worship from other faiths by any chance? Any, whether it be Muslim or Jewish or any other faith that's not Christian? Did you hear from any of those?
We actually heard from a rabbi of a synagogue. Other than that was it. Outside of our faith as Christians, anyway.
You're clearly a pretty resolute guy, and I think again, I want to make clear, I've never met Pastor Phil before. This is the first time he and I have spoken. But it's not hard to get that you're if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this kind of guy. You mentioned some of the pushback that you got on some of your videos on the Abundant Life page. You talked about some of the hatred you mentioned that was spewed at you. I'm curious, was there anything that was said on Facebook or emails or phone call or text message, anything you heard from anyone that at any point made you go, man, I don't know, did we make a mistake here? Was there any, you say now that you didn't regret it, and I believe you, obviously. Is there any point in the process that anything that was said to you that you go, gosh, that's a good point, I don't know if we're making the right move here?
Yeah. So when you're in the middle of a firefight, I think it caused you to pause. Oh my goodness, was this the right decision? Looking back, no regret about it. But in the middle of it, which, I'm talking the immediate days afterwards.
Sure.
It is not the hatred and the hostility leveled toward me personally, the names. I mean, I was called Pastor blankety blank asterisk. And
yeah.
Look, come on. They crucified Jesus. They hung him on a cross. Not for what he did exclusively, but what he said. He claimed to be the Son of God. I think as Christians, we've got to be willing to accept some persecution. In fact, the Apostle Paul said to his son in the faith, Timothy, all that live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. And I think Christians in America, we don't know how to handle that very well. We've been used to being mainstream, home field advantage. And so, look, when people don't like you for loving Jesus, you need to get over it. But in this case, it really has to do with the genuine love for people we do have. We care about our city. And, my I guess, self-doubt in those days following was, my goodness, will we be able to reach anybody after this that needs Jesus? Will this cause us to lose so much credibility in our own city that nobody will ever believe anything we say again when we say we care about our city?
Sure.
Most people that don't go to church, Taylor, they don't hate the church. They don't hate God. They just don't know God, and they don't know that much about the church. So, I look at it as, let's say 30% of Kansas Cityans have a faith. They go to church. 30% of Kansas Cityans have no faith, and they're even maybe hostile to faith. They're hostile toward God. We're not probably going to reach those. But the 40% in the middle, that they don't have an opinion either way. They're not hostile toward God. They just don't know much about God. They're not really hostile toward the church. They just don't have one. Those are the folks especially that I was concerned about in the middle of this, that need Jesus. They need a relationship with God. The number one need of a human person is redemption. We all need redemption because we have all fallen. Romans 3:10, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23, there is none righteous, no, not one. So here's the point, that Jesus came and died for all of us to redeem us from sin's penalty so that we can be near a God who is holy and sinless, to know him. And, our number one mission as a church is to share the gospel. That's the good news, that Christ died for sin and rose again. And so, we've worked so hard to not just say it, but show it through the years. And, is this small parenthesis in time as it relates to the 20 years we've been doing this, is it going to erase all the good that we've done? And it hasn't. That's the good news. It hasn't. I mean, there are so many stories I could share that abound of lives that are being changed by Christ just here in the last 3 or 4 weeks, besides the last 3 or 4 months. But in the middle of it, that was my concern, is that people will forever remember the church that sued Jackson County instead of the church that has that awesome food pantry.
Sure.
And this amazing partnership with the public school system and this incredible carnival they put on every year to bless people and ask for nothing. That is what I guess I feared at the time, Taylor.
And I don't mind saying I understand the relative unfairness of what I'm about to say, seeing as how I've never set foot in Abundant Life Church. But just as a person of faith, as a churchgoer all my life, I don't mind telling you that I didn't know what I really thought about it whenever you guys, whenever your church announced that lawsuit. I mean, I read about it on the news the day after it happened, or the day after it was announced. As just a person of faith and a churchgoer, some of those things you're talking about, I don't mind telling you, I thought, is this a more harm than good kind of situation? Like, is this a, for lack of a better term, black mark on a church that they're bringing it upon themselves, so to speak? And trust me, I got in long spirals of thought about how much of faith is bringing something upon yourself, so to speak. And so I don't mind telling you that was a challenge for me, and honestly still is, of trying to decide if that was the right move or a good move or any of those things. I'm curious about actual COVID in your congregation. Has Abundant Life lost anybody because of COVID? Have you had anybody very sick or death there?
Yeah, well, praise God. We have not had a death that I know of as somebody directly related to our congregation, as a member of our congregation. Now, we have had, I'm sure, family members, extended family members,
sure,
who have died of COVID. But in terms of people in our own congregation directly, I don't know of anyone who's died of COVID. Now, we've had people certainly who have contracted COVID,
sure,
most of which have been very mild symptoms, that, haven't been really, really sick with COVID, but we've had a few have been very sick with COVID.
First, thank you for talking about that. I'm going to switch topics before I run out of time with you, but I appreciate your candor on that particular topic. I want to ask you about, on the topic of persecution, something we just talked about a lot in that particular vein. This year has been ugly in terms of hatred, in terms of people feeling different thoughts about what exactly is persecution than maybe they ever have before. I think the obvious line there is with the Black Lives Matter movement, people of color all together, maybe people realizing something that they never had before. But I speak to you here as a former police officer, the persecution, quote unquote, of law enforcement and the way that has been reacted to this year. As a former cop, and as a person obviously of faith, what has it been like watching that COVID and that societal unrest are the two biggest stories of this very, very rough year? What's it been like watching that as a former member of law enforcement and now as a relatively new pastor?
Yeah. So I think like most Americans, Taylor, it has been a year of heartache and heartbreak and just honestly mourning some of what we're seeing happen in society. I've had days, frankly, where I was on the brink of tears, just watching what is happening, not just from the impact of COVID with, a death count and the real loss of life, to the loss of livelihoods and, jobs and people's lives really, really being upended financially from, businesses that may never reopen. And then, on top of that, the racial tension that has been brought on again by the George Floyd incident. And then the horrible, all this comes in an election year where the country's more divided than it has maybe been in generations.
Sure.
Politically speaking. So the tension, the hostility, the division. And I told our church a few weeks ago, as Christians, this is the age of you divide into your tribes, turfism, tribalism, division, my people, their people, us people. As Christians, we don't think in a left or right world. We are called to think in an up and down world. We're either bringing God glory or we're detracting from God's glory. We're called to think biblically, not politically. And so every issue we face, every decision we make has to be made through that biblical lens, not that political lens. It cannot be made through, I'm an American Christian or I'm a Black Christian. I have to make those decisions through, I'm a Christian, because any adjective I put in front of that becomes a distortion of how I walk out my life as a Christian. And that is why the church has to lead the way. We're called to lead the way. There are times throughout society, legislation is needed to bring about change, reforms, etc. But the reality is, legislation can address the outside, but sin, and specifically racism, exists on the inside. And only God can address that. And that is why the church at times hasn't done a great job leading the way through these issues. And we need to. And I told our church recently, I preached a whole message on race. We're launching a ministry called the Peace Ministry that is specifically a ministry to address the race issue in our city, racial reconciliation. We're partnering with urban churches. We're partnering with African-American congregations. I have partnerships and friendships with African-American pastors to move together to, over the course of time, no more just one and done prayer rally when something bad happens. We're going to have an intentional missional approach to addressing the race issue in our city. Galatians 3:28 says that in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. And that is what we want to put on display in our city. And what that means is we're not going to choose sides. Look, we are called to support law enforcement, and we are called to support what amounts to Black justice and seek equality for all Americans.
Yeah.
And we're not going to choose between the two. And this is a day and age where you got to choose your side. No, in this case, God is on all sides. So we're going to think like Christians. We're going to support our law enforcement. And I will absolutely promise you, as having been deeply embedded for 8 years in the law enforcement community, the average law enforcement officer in America, there's 800,000. All they want to do is serve and protect their city. They are good people. They signed up to be on the right side as the good guys. They're not bad people. They're not racist people. But if there's 800,000, we're naive to think that among those 800,000, there aren't some bad people that do bad things. So let's not look the other way. Let's address those issues. At the same time, let's support the average officer in America that's in dangerous places and dangerous people dealing with dangerous things every day, making split-second decisions the average American will never have to make. All right, let's give them a little grace because most of them are doing a good job. At the same time, let's not look the other way and act like there's no problems in America the Beautiful. America the Beautiful has a few blemishes, and so let's address those too.
I want to wrap up by asking you for some advice. The old adage is you can't talk about religion and politics or anything like that. You know, religion's supposed to be one of those things that don't talk about that unless you know exactly what you're getting into, unless you're very comfortable with that person, that kind of situation. But it comes up whether we follow that advice or not. We're coming up on Thanksgiving in a few weeks where people are, hopefully you'll be able to gather with your family if that's something that you're not kept from doing because of COVID. That's always the talk about what you argue about over the Thanksgiving table. I don't think it's impossible. In fact, I know it's not impossible for Christians to be able to avoid arguments. It can't be done. We're going to be, whether we seek them out or whether people seek us out because of them, we're going to be pulled into arguments. I think fairly or unfairly, a lot of the times this year, Christians have been, or church-going people have been painted as the people that when someone says Black Lives Matter, respond with, well, all lives matter. God would say all lives matter. That has been a quick response. Argument about any of these things, whether it be COVID or the election or racism. As someone who's been in the middle of a lot of fights just in the last 6 months, what would your advice be to a person of faith when they are drawn into, or whether they enter into on their own volition, an argument over one of these topics? What's the best practice?
Yeah, great question, Taylor. Look, Christians have a deep conviction for truth. Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So by nature, we are advocates of truth. But Jesus also said, blessed are the peacemakers. So wherever we can make peace and keep the peace, we should choose peace, not war. Okay. I think sometimes you can have the right position, but the wrong disposition. So I would remind everybody to not just have the right position, but also the right disposition, because sometimes Christians can have the wrong disposition, even if they have the right position. So we need to learn to disagree without being disagreeable, so to speak. We need to, I think, learn to have a conversation, to seek to understand before being understood. And then I think remember to make a connection before we start making corrections, because we like to correct before we connect, and then you can't have a conversation from there. And it's really all about having a conversation. Taylor, I think I've lost you. I don't see you anymore. Taylor, you still there? You're back.
I lost you for a little bit there. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
I think I'm back now, and I apologize that that's exactly when I asked you a big, important question. So I'm going to, I don't know how much of that Ashley got, and I apologize if you have to start over. I heard, obviously, I asked my question. I heard you say that's a great question, and then as Christians. So if you wouldn't mind starting, just answering that question again.
Yeah, I don't mind a bit. So it is a great question, because as Christians, we by nature have a deep conviction for truth. All right, Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." So one of our core values is truth. In this age of deception and distortion and fake news, and it is a deep core value of followers of Jesus to be people of truth. And so sometimes I think that passion and that conviction can come off as anger. And when you're angry, you can't have a conversation. And so I would tell all Christians that while we stand for truth, let's be known for love, because Jesus said, "By this will all men know you're my disciples, by your love one for another." So let's stand for truth, but let's do it with love. All right. So it's one thing to have the right position, but so much of the time we have the wrong disposition. So it's not enough to have the right position. If you have the wrong disposition, you can't have a conversation. I would say remember to connect before you start to correct. All right. Too many people want to make a correction before they have a relational connection. And again, that ends the conversation. And so the win is when we seek to understand, not just being understood. If you're doing all the talking and none of the listening, it's not going well. You know what I'm saying? And
Amen.
sometimes we're not good at listening. We like to do a lot of the talking.
Well, you just got a Zoom virtual amen from me, Pastor Phil. So I agree with that, because I've definitely been in parts of conversations where this year, I think more than any other year of my life, I've forced myself to be more of a listener. I talk for a living, but I have really, I know how to do it as a job. I mean, I listen to people all the time whenever I go and interview them, but I've caught myself realizing that maybe just as a person sometimes I need to be better at that part too. Something I'm already trained to do is to listen to people. So Pastor Phil, I wouldn't take all this time and not give you a chance to tell people about Abundant Life. If somebody watches this and says, "I'd like to go talk to this guy, I'd like to visit his church," when can someone come and visit Abundant Life, or what's their best practice there?
Sure. Well, the best way to get a hold of us or find out more about us would be our webpage, livingproof.co. It's livingproof.co. You can get on the webpage and reach out to me directly. You'll find a staff link, and my email would be right next to my picture, right next to my name. They can email me directly. Of course, has all of our service times and locations on that as well, Taylor. It's great talking with you today.
Pastor Phil, I can't thank you enough for your time, for your honesty and candor there describing some of these conversations. And I hope your church has great blessings moving forward this year and next. Thank you very much.
Likewise. God bless you, Taylor.